In 1986, a 20-year-old man drove his car deep into the Maine woods, parked it, left the keys inside, and walked into the forest. He did not return for 27 years. No phone calls, no letters, no contact with another human being, not his family, not his friends, not a single person for nearly 3 decades. This is the story of Christopher Knight, known to the world as the North Pond Hermit. And what he discovered about solitude, survival, and the human mind is more unsettling than anyone expected. Christopher Knight was not running from anything dramatic. No crime, no tragedy, no specific trauma that anyone has ever identified. He simply did not feel like he fit in with people. After graduating high school in central Maine, he worked briefly installing alarm systems. And then, one day in 1986, he drove north, parked his car in the woods, and walked away from civilization entirely. He told investigators later that he had not planned it. There was no manifesto, no grand philosophy driving the decision. He simply walked into the forest because he wanted to, and then he kept walking until he found a spot deep in the woods near North Pond in Maine that felt right. He built a small camp hidden in dense forest, surrounded by boulders that made it nearly invisible even to people walking close by. And there, he stayed. For 27 years, Christopher Knight survived almost entirely through theft. He could not grow food in Maine's brutal winters using only what he could carry. He could not hunt without revealing his location through gunshots, so he developed a different strategy entirely. He stole. Over nearly 3 decades, Knight committed more than 1,000 burglaries, entering nearby cabins and a summer camp, taking food, propane, batteries, books, and clothing. He was meticulous. He never took everything. He left enough that owners often did not immediately notice. He moved only at night, using stealth and patience he had spent years perfecting. He never confronted anyone. He never stole anything of significant value beyond survival necessities. He took books, hundreds of them over the years, reading voraciously in his isolation. He took batteries to power a small radio, his only connection to a world he had otherwise abandoned. The local community came to fear an unseen presence. Cabin owners reported missing food, missing supplies, doors mysteriously unlocked. They called him a ghost. Some believed there were multiple thieves. Nobody imagined it was one man, alone, surviving an unimaginable existence in the woods nearby. Knight's camp was a marvel of careful concealment. Tucked between two boulders, covered by a tarp, surrounded by dense trees that hid it from view even at close range, he built a shelter that protected him from Maine winters that regularly dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit. He did not light fires. Smoke would have revealed his location instantly to anyone in the surrounding area. Instead, he relied entirely on layers of stolen clothing, sleeping bags, and a propane heater used sparingly to avoid drawing attention. He survived winters that killed experienced outdoorsmen. He endured isolation that breaks most people within weeks. And he did it using nothing but discipline, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to move without being detected. In nearly 3 decades, during which an entire community searched for the person stealing their supplies, nobody ever saw him. Not once. Not a single confirmed sighting in 27 years. What Christopher Knight discovered about solitude during those 27 years has become one of the most studied accounts of extreme isolation in modern psychology. He described, in interviews conducted after his capture, an experience that defies typical assumptions about loneliness. He said that for long stretches he did not feel lonely at all. The forest became, in his words, a kind of meditation. Time passed differently. He stopped thinking in terms of days or weeks. The changing seasons became his only calendar. He read constantly, using a small flashlight at night to read books he had stolen, devouring philosophy, science, history, fiction. Reading became his primary connection to human thought, even as he had severed nearly all connection to human contact. He described a profound sense of clarity. Without the constant noise of social interaction, without the pressure to perform a personality for others, he said his mind became remarkably quiet. He described watching the same patch of forest change through 27 cycles of seasons with an intimacy that almost no human being ever experiences. But he also described something darker. Knight admitted that prolonged isolation eroded parts of his mind in ways he did not immediately recognize. He described difficulty, later articulating thoughts in conversation, having spent so many years without speaking aloud that his verbal processing had measurably changed. Researchers who studied his case noted that extreme isolation of this duration is almost without precedent in modern recorded history. There is no other documented case of voluntary isolation lasting this long, with no human contact whatsoever. He said that toward the end, identity itself became strange to him. Without anyone to reflect himself back to him, no conversations, no relationships, no social mirror, he described a kind of erosion of self. Not madness, not breakdown, but a profound unfamiliarity with what it even meant to be a person among people. Psychologists who later studied his case pointed to this as one of the most striking findings. Human identity, it turns out, may be far more dependent on social interaction than most people realize. We do not simply have a self that exists independently. We construct our sense of self partly through being seen, known, and responded to by others. Remove that entirely for 27 years and something fundamental begins to change. In April 2013, Christopher Knight's extraordinary solitude ended not by his choice. A game warden, finally aware of his pattern after using a hidden trail camera, caught him in the act of one of his thousands of burglaries. Knight did not resist. He later told investigators that in some sense capture came as something close to relief. He was 47 years old. He had entered the woods as a 20-year-old. He emerged having missed the entire technological transformation of modern life: cell phones, the internet as it exists today, social media, an entirely changed world he had to somehow comprehend all at once. He pleaded guilty to dozens of burglary and theft charges. He served 7 months in jail, an environment that after 27 years of total isolation presented its own profound psychological challenge. Being surrounded by other inmates after decades of total solitude was, he said, almost as disorienting as the isolation itself had been. After his release, Knight largely avoided media attention, declining most interview requests. He gave limited access to journalist Michael Finkel, who wrote extensively about his case, and those conversations remain one of the only windows into what nearly 3 decades of total isolation actually does to a human mind. Knight expressed something that surprised many people who expected him to romanticize his choice. He did not encourage anyone to follow his path. He described it not as an adventure or a spiritual journey, but as something closer to an addiction, a compulsion towards solitude that once begun became extraordinarily difficult to interrupt. He said the silence became its own kind of trap, comfortable in ways that made the idea of returning to human contact feel almost unbearable. The longer he stayed, the harder leaving became, not because the forest was so wonderful, but because re-entering human society felt increasingly impossible the longer he avoided it. What Christopher Knight's story reveals goes beyond one unusual man's choices. It touches something more universal. Human beings are, by nearly every measure of evolutionary biology and psychology, profoundly social creatures. We evolved in groups. Our brains are wired for connection, communication, and social feedback in ways so fundamental that most of us never think about it. Knight's 27 years stand as a kind of accidental experiment, showing both how far a human being can stretch the boundaries of solitude and what is quietly lost in the process. He found a form of peace that most people never access, a mind stripped of social performance, social anxiety, the endless noise of being perceived by others. But he also lost something: the ease of conversation, the unconscious comfort of simply being known by another person, the parts of identity that exist only in relation to others. His story does not offer a simple lesson. It offers something more honest. Solitude, in extreme doses, reveals both the strength and the fragility of what makes us human, and reminds us that connection, however exhausting or complicated it sometimes feels, is not optional for the human mind. It is structural, it is foundational, and Christopher Knight spent 27 years proving exactly what happens when it disappears entirely.